Morning all. Congratulations goes to Michael Adams for winning the British Championship with a round to spare. He defeated Grandmaster Simon Williams yesterday to be on 9 points today. And he's playing Peter Wells today, but it's academic as far as winning the championship. No one can catch him. His nearest rivals are actually 2 points away, so even if he loses today, he still won it with a point ahead. Okay, so how did he beat Simon Williams? By the way, congratulations also goes to Adam Hunt. Fantastic performance. His sister is also very strong, Harriet Hunt, who I once played. Well, I played actually maybe 2 or 3 times. I beat her once in a 30-minute game actually a few years ago. But anyway, congratulations to Adam. Grandmaster norm for him. Massive TPR, tournament performance rating. Alright, so the Adams game. So E4, C5. So Williams playing the Sicilian defence. Knight F3, D6. And I think this is called the Moscow variation. The Moscow variation with Bishop D7. So because Bishop B5 check. And you may be aware that Kasparov used this against the rest of the world when he played this team correspondence consultation game. And we're following the same moves now. Bishop D7. And White exchanges off light squared bishop. And you might think this hasn't got too much venom. You know, White exchange off the bishops. Well, the idea is this dreaded Maroczy bind, which is the theme of this video. So the Maroczy bind is this bind on that D5 square. And usually these pawns have been exchanged off. So White's actually hitting D6, making a liberating E6 and D5 much more difficult later if there's pressure on that D6 from that semi-open file. So we have though now Knight F6, Knight C3. Now Black plays G6, and now we see this exchange of pawns. So we have a true like Maroczy bind setup here, this pawn formation against the preventive D5. And you might think, well, Black has got other sources of counterplay, but sometimes they're difficult to arrange. For example, A6 and B5 or F5 later might be ways, or alternatively just playing on the dark squares. The dark square strategy though is a bit less effective because of this exchange of light square bishops, because often this could have been a bad bishop in the endgame, this bishop on, maybe if it was on E2 or D3. If Black could range an endgame where the king's coming out like to D4, or there's knights on E5 and C5, often Black can get a better ending with knight versus bishop, but this is not the case here. So that's one positional scenario ruled out by the bishop exchange. So it's got some of the advantages of the Maroczy, the binding, without some of the positional problems. So F3, and it looks as though this is a bit slow and luxurious from White to play F3 and bishop E3. Okay, so Black exerts now immediate pressure on the C4 pawn. But again, another seemingly slow, luxurious move, B3. And I was thinking, well, this is a nice visual sort of formation. This kind of elegance of White's formation is to be admired here. But with B3, is there a tactical liability? Is C3 a bit looser? Can Black really arrange A6 and B5 maybe? Well, actually, Simon was tempted actually for another kind of breakout, more radical in the centre with E6. And it's interesting to see how this was punished in this game. First, the tactical liability is dealt with. Rook C1 to protect that knight, allowing the seemingly liberating D5. Okay, has the Maroczy been, has it been unbound now, this bind? Well, yes, in a way, but there's a big concession. With this E6 and D5, Black has done a kind of French defence, E6, D5. And what's the problem with the French? The dark squares. Now here, C5 in particular seems to be screaming out in this game as a major issue. If we look at now what happened, E5, and after knight E8, Adams took on D5, so he's fixing that D5 pawn. Now he plays F4. Okay, so White can't really get at E5, but C5 proves to be a major issue now. After castles, knight C7, Adams took on C6. Seemingly, letting black off the isolated D pawn, but we have here some major wounds on this diagonal and these dark squares in particular, and c5, b6 and this a pawn are all a bit vulnerable now. In fact, the vulnerability of c5 is exploited immediately by Adams' next move. I wonder if you can spot it if I give you 5 seconds. Okay, Adams played knight e4. Maybe knight a4 is also an idea. But this move has a bit more venom for coming into d6 as well as c5. So knight e8, now knight c5. And you might think, oh, what's the big deal? Okay, there's a knight on c5. It's starting to be really uncomfortable for black. Now Adams plays knight d3 with the idea that maybe bishop c5 as well as just bishop d4, keeping this bind on these pawns. Okay, so queen e6, and now we see a very interesting maneuver here, queen f3. And you may be thinking, what's the point of this? Is it preparing something crude like f5? Well, that's possible, but that's not really the case here. Williams played now a5, which slightly loosens actually b6 and the a5 pawn itself. And again, the knight goes on to c5 now, kicking the queen back. And now a little prophylactic move perhaps against d4, but also maybe the bishop can usefully come out to h4 at some point. Rook a b8. And now a curious move, queen h3. What's the point of this, you might ask? Now, to test the point of this, obviously white's got a bit of pressure on c8. But what's the big deal with that? So to test it, I actually inserted a dummy move to analyse with an engine. And in fact, the idea here would be knight d7. Because then, for example, with rook b7, pardon me, there would be knight f6 check, which is hitting that rook now, which is now unprotected, winning the exchange. If any takes, then queen takes c8. But actually, also, if rook a8, then here there'll be knight b6. So queen h3 has a bit of venom to it, and it's to this that Williams decided to play f5, seemingly a bit weakening, but giving white this protected passed pawn. But if it can be blockaded, maybe it's not a problem. The problem, though, is now these vulnerable squares in black's position. So queen c3 hitting a5. So Simon protects that pawn, but unfortunately now knight a4. And this looks like quiet stuff, doesn't it? But actually white's threatening to win the exchange. What does black do? You can't play rook b8 without losing the a pawn now. Queen takes a5. So there's enormous pressure being exerted by these three pieces on these vulnerable dark squares. Very annoying. And Williams plays, Simon plays a bit of a dodgy move. He plays rook a6. And all Adam does is another quiet move, and believe it or not, Simon resigned here. So it's as if nothing happened in this game. I mean, but if rook a8, then knight b6 wins the exchange. If queen b7, then knight c5, for example. Well, that's a pretty interesting example. It seemed like just winning a rook. What can be done here if rook c8, then something else horrible is bound to happen here. I think knight b6. If rook a7, then knight c8, for example, looks pretty strong. So it's just quite incredible, I think. But with this queen d3 and black's resignation, Adams reached 9 points and has won the British Championship 2010, being held at the University of Canterbury. So queen d3 and that's it. So the Maroczy bind was a kind of success, not because of the bind, but because of black's attempt to break the bind and the resulting dark square weaknesses on the queen side. It's an incredible way to win a game, a very quiet kind of win. Let's have a look at that in action replay. So this is what also Kasparov used against the rest of the world. So c4. Now here, actually, after knight c3, the world team, when Kasparov played it, played actually knight, after c4, played actually knight c6, and this was the continuation, where black actually immediately hit c4 with the queen. It was very interesting. There was an exchange sacrifice for a pawn or two, but the world lost eventually. But in this game, the bind is kind of allowed without an immediate attack on c4. It only came later with this rook c8. And now it seems, you know, this luxurious move with the tactical liability of the knight on c3, with that rook blasting down the c file, Simon decides to go for the central break, not a6 and b5. Maybe a6, white just plays a4 anyway, and then black would have to sort of find counterplay in some other way. So e6, and now this seemingly liberating d5, but it's just proven to be an illusion. So f4, and it seems black is inflicted with severe structural damage, in fact losing structural damage here because of that c5 square being the new kind of bind, the alternative bind, and the weaknesses on the queen side. I guess you could say Simon didn't need to play a5. You know, maybe there were more accurate ways of playing it, but it was another position where, you know, another GM is struggling to find counterplay against Adams, and when he does try and liberate his position, he's just ending up with fatal weaknesses. So queen d3, and that's it. Adams is the new British champion. Congratulations to him. It was in a way an honour for other people to have a 2700 in the field. There's rumours next year that maybe Nigel Short will be playing. I hope so. It was quite exciting for me personally that Adams was playing again, and he's won it again. It was the last time he won it was in 1989, so it was a bit of a junior back then. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.